Hey folks, Valentin the Mad here, and today I have a new dev interview. This one is with Sean, the developer of Project Moonborn, a 2D werewolf game. Talking about what it is, how it will play, the game modes, character abilities, his inspirations, of course the gore, damage variations, death animations, blood spilling, aftermath, and, as you may have seen in the excerpt, how he got started with game development, having very little background in this field. He has sent a good bit of early gameplay footage and, as you can see, some fun behind the scenes gore stuff as well. Now, without further ado, here it is. Alright, so hi, welcome, let's begin with your introduction.
Hi, my name is Sean, and I'm working on Project Moonborn. So basically what Project Moonborn is, just to do a brief recap, it's a 2D roguelike platformer where you play a rather powerful werewolf and you're essentially trying to escape prison after you've been taken capture by a scrupulous organization that wants to use you and your pups for nefarious reasons. So it's a very combat-focused game with lots of gore, lots of character upgrading, and just crazy movement and lots of randomization and procedurally generated maps and levels and tons of enemies to kill and slaughter in very, very satisfying ways.
Nice, yeah. So I have seen some cool features. One that really came up is the companion aspect, so you won't always be just slaughtering enemies alone.
No, basically, currently, you will be seeking out your little wolf pups to rescue them. The idea is to guide them back to your wolf den, which is sort of the, essentially, you know how most, or at least many RPGs, they have essentially what's a campfire, where you return after you venture out into the world, you do some quests, you do whatever you do, you return to your campfire, which is sort of like this safe little space where you can take time to upgrade your gear, sort your inventory, talk to companions. So the wolf den is essentially that, and you bring your little wolf pups back to that place, where you'll then have a mission table where you can send them off to scavenge for you. You can do some combat training with them, and I'm currently planning on having systems that if you slate one of your wolf pups for combat training, you'll be able to bring it with you when you actually go out and play the game, and it'll be this little combat companion that will follow you around. And I'm working on some systems where you can potentially pick it up and throw it at people and it'll gnaw on their faces and whatnot. In addition to that, regarding the companion system, there is wisp companions, which are sort of magical little sprites that you can attach to an equipment slot on your shoulder. And these are sort of magical, ethereal-like things that also follow you around. They basically give you some passive bonuses, and most of them have an active effect of some sort. It can be an attack, it could be a defensive move, it can be lots of different things. So that's sort of the basics of the companion system currently.
Nice. And previously you have mentioned, I think, roguelike, right?
Yes. The plan is, in terms of roguelike, the game will, well, I do plan on having several modes, but I don't want to promise too many things because game modes they're very extensive. They take a lot of development and a lot of time. So currently I'm planning on having 2 game modes, one which is very roguelike and one which is more of a linear, basically a story mode, where you can play from start to finish and it'll be largely the same. But the roguelike aspect will basically be the game generates a random map for you. So it procedurally generates a large map and places all sorts of points of interest and different stages, and everything inside of them is randomized. Enemies, the loot you gather, object positions. And so every time you restart and run again, everything re-randomizes. And the roguelike aspect also ties into how you collect abilities. Because you're a werewolf, you don't collect hats and boots and gloves. Instead, you collect combat abilities and trinkets and symbiotes that you can equip. And all of these are effectively, they add new combat abilities that you can use. They have their own animations. They have unique effects. They can be leveled up. They can be improved. And all this is also randomized. So it's always procedural where you get them, what you get, so on and so forth.
Alright, let's discuss the abilities. So, as you were saying, you have more than just the claws of your werewolf.
Yeah.
What else can it do to enemies?
So basically, in terms of combat, you have what I call basic attacks, which are your bare bones. You just hit the attack button, and your werewolf will do a string of basically comboing attacks. Then you have core abilities. These are also things that you always have available. They're more advanced things, such as slide attacks, pouncers, the various forms of kicking attacks. There's dive attacks. There's air dashes, there's back dashes. There's a very rather complicated movement system that flows very naturally into the whole combat experience. You can combine all these different core abilities. For example, you can do a slide, and then you can use that forward momentum to do a jump, which can turn into a gravity jump that gives you crazy forward movement speed. All of this is based on a stamina system. So you have some resources that you want to manage. But all of this, again, can be upgraded as you gain XP. You can gain more stamina regeneration. You can gain increased stamina, so on and so forth. And then the third and last type is the techniques. These are effectively the things that you find. So when you start the game, you have your basic abilities and your core abilities. Those are always available. And they're very powerful. You can really do a lot just with your basic and core attacks. But once you start finding techniques, these are randomized. You never know what you're going to get. They're very, very powerful. And currently I have 21 different ones, and they all have unique animations, unique effects, how they interact with the game, what they do, the damage they deal, the type of damage. And you can have 5 of these equipped at any time. They're on a hotbar. You can swap them to wherever you want. So you can basically, if you have a favorite and you find that, well, you can swap it in and use it. And if you have more than 5, you're going to have to pick which ones you want to use. And these techniques can be upgraded. So if you find duplicates, because the loot is randomized, you might find the same technique multiple times, but then it gets converted into knowledge points, which you can use to upgrade and level up the techniques that you have. So they become even more powerful in terms of their base stats. And in addition to that, when they hit a rank up tier, you get a selection of traits. You can select 1 of 4 traits, 3 of which are randomized from a pool of different traits related to whatever combat technique. And some techniques will have traits that others don't, and you basically get to pick up to 3 different traits that you can add to your technique. And these traits will have all sorts of effects. Some of them will cause enemies to be blinded. Some will cause them to be vulnerable, so they take increased physical damage. Some of them might add fire damage to your technique. Other ones might lower enemies' resistance to fire so that your fire techniques deal even more damage. Some of them will deal stunning. Some of them will deal ambush, so if you hit them from behind, it's automatic crit. There's tons of different traits that you can apply to these techniques. They're really fun.
Alright, so mention some of those techniques. I have seen acid.
Yes, there's basic elements right now. There's acid, fire, cold, and lightning. In addition to that, there's 2 supernatural elements, radiance and void, but those are very rare. And the difference, well, the primary difference between, so the basic ones, acid, fire, cold, lightning, those are standard elements. So enemies can and may have resistances to them, right? They may have fire resistance, so they take reduced fire damage. But radiance and void, nothing has resistances to those elements. So if you can find techniques that have these damage types, or if you get lucky with your trait selection and you get to add radiance damage to a trait, that's a very powerful and rather rare trait to have. There will, by the way, also be unique traits, which are super rare and usually quite exotic.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think we'll go to the gore now, so the response for the very exotic traits and everything else basically. Let's talk about the fun side, the visual, damage and
oh yes,
messing up characters with all of that fun stuff.
One of my favorite parts, yes. Yeah, I knew from the start that I wanted the game to be very gory. In fact, one of the core design pillars that I had was that I wanted the game to be fun killing enemies in such a degree that even if that was all you ever did, like if you just ran around and slaughtered enemies in an empty room, that in itself would be so much fun that you would, I want to go again. I want to see how I can kill these guys this time. I want to see how many death animations I can get, how much carnage I can cause. So I knew from the very start that I wanted the game to be gory. And I'm also always been inspired by very gory games of the past. Doom, Fallout, Mortal Kombat, all those types of pixel art, very graphic, gory games. And I love animating it. Sounds a little grotesque, but I do. It's one of the things that I really like animating is gore and death animation. So there's going to be a lot of those in the game. And not only am I animating them by hand, so all these exotic types that you can rip enemies apart, but there's also a ragdoll system in game, which is partially procedural. So like, for example, a ragdoll might be you decapitate an enemy's entire upper body and the whole upper body goes flying into the air. Well, that ragdoll consists of multiple components that can be procedurally generated. So even though you are, say, ripping a guy in half, it's not always going to be the exact same visual look that he has. Sometimes it might also rip off half of his arm. That's completely procedural. Sometimes it might tear off the head. Sometimes both arms come off. Other times the torso is largely intact. Sometimes it's partially bisected or the whole chest cage is ripped open. It's very, very colorful.
Yeah, speaking of color, mentioned let's talk about the aspect of painting the environment.
Yes.
What you got, like if you're planning perhaps to make further enhancements?
Oh yes, so currently there is permanent blood splatter in the game. It's using a decal system that's actually super performant. I can literally have multiple thousands of individual blood splatters and it will not affect it will affect the performance very, very, very little. So you can really, once you start murdering these guys and blood sprays all over the place, floors and walls and ceilings will be covered in blood and it's permanent. Once it's there for the entire play session. If you leave a level and come back, all that blood will be exactly where you left it. Bodies will stay as well. There's no disintegrating or fading or despawning enemy corpses. They all stay permanently. So there are some limitations right now that I am working on, and that is things such as severed body parts. Because they're ragdolls, they may impact performance a bit more than simply having a sprite painted onto a decal atlas. So I'm looking into some possibilities of what I can do, because I would really like for everything to be as permanent as possible, right? So if you rip off an enemy's arm that goes flopping all over the place with full physics ragdolls, it'd be nice if that was there as well. And it doesn't despawn. Well, it does right now, but I'm looking into possibilities of leaving those as well, in addition to just enhancing the gore. One thing that I will mention that I'm very inspired by in terms of gore, which is a very recent thing, is the brutality mod for Doom. A project, what's it called? Brutal Doom, it's called.
Oh yeah, it's a classic, basically.
Yes, yeah. One of the things that I really love about that mod, and something that I'm absolutely going to dig into with Moonborn at some point, is bloody flesh chunks and bits of brain that splatter on the walls and sort of slide down and hang off the ceiling and drop off the ceiling. That's the kind of stuff that I really want to try and get that kind of gore levels implemented into Project Moonborn.
Yeah, the chunks are very often overlooked, and perhaps I imagine, like, once the chunk lands it can just freeze, I suppose, right? Doesn't have to be responding to everything that happens around it.
Yeah, true. Yeah, there's many ways of doing it. It's just about figuring out all the technical details. But I'll get to it. There's a lot of things, and I'm sort of flip-flopping between many different things in the game. Sometimes I just feel like, today I'll work on the gore, I'll add more death effects, and I'll, so it's a long list, but gore is definitely, it's very high up on my to-do list.
Oh yeah, I mean, it is, it got my attention now, and definitely you got my interest even more with the planned chunks.
Oh yes, absolutely. I'm actually looking forward to working on that. I might push it forward a little bit now that we're talking about it.
Alright, I was gonna mention it before, but the conversation was asking for gore, so right now let's talk about your inspirations. Like, how did you come up with it? What were the inspirations other than the Doom, Fallout and such?
Yeah, So I played a lot of arcade games as a kid. Golden Axe, Streets of Rage, Final Fight, those kinds of games. And I've always loved that type of game. But I've always also loved the more recent roguelike genre, like Binding of Isaac, Near and Abyss. So there's a lot of inspiration from those games. And it's funny because initially the game was meant to be. I don't know if you've ever played a game called Moonstone: A Hard Day's Night.
No, haven't.
No, it's an old game. I think it was originally on DOS for PC, and then it got ported to Amiga, which is where I was introduced to it. And initially, Moonborn was supposed to be essentially a clone of Moonstone, which is more sort of a you start on an overworld map and you move your little character around, and then you go into these battle arenas and you fight all sorts of monsters. And then it becomes like a 2D game, like the old beat 'em up games, but also a super gory game. I think you'd dig it. You should try and look up a video on it. Very, very gory death animations, chopping people's heads off, and your knight getting splattered with the legs going flying to both sides, and blood everywhere. Very brutal game. So those were the types of games that were my main inspiration for Moonborn. And I was working on trying to do that, but I ran into some technical issues that at the time, I couldn't solve. Because when I started the project, I didn't really know how to code. I didn't know how to do game development. So not only was it sort of a passion project, a lifelong dream come true for me to do this game, it was also a learning experience. I was learning how to develop games, how to program as I went along. And as technical difficulties cropped up, I eventually started to change direction. I thought I have to learn some more stuff before I can get this vision to fruition. So Moonborn went from being originally a werewolf versus vampires in a subway to becoming a alien lizard-like creature aboard a space station where you were going to try and escape, which is very close to what it is now. But that was one of the original concepts. I went away from that. And then I started trying to do the Moonstone clone, ran into technical difficulties, couldn't do it. And then eventually I settled on, I'm just going to go full 2D, full physics-based 2D platformer. But I'm going to grab the werewolf concept from my Moonstone clone idea and change the lizard creature from what was originally called Project Emma, and then sort of amalgamate and combine all those ideas into what then became Project Moonborn, where you play as a werewolf in space, essentially.
Alright, so you actually got my interest with a certain thing you mentioned. So you mentioned like having zero knowledge of coding, of anything game dev related.
Yep.
And you had a concept in mind, you wanted to have it done.
Yeah.
So perhaps we have a viewer right now who also kind of feels the same way. Has some idea, has some concept, has no clue whatsoever how to approach it. So if you could talk more in detail about your experience in this regard.
Oh yes. I started in 2018 and I did not know how to write a single line of code, like absolutely nothing. I'd never worked in a game engine before, so I came in, the only knowledge I had was music, because that's sort of the thing that I've been doing most of my life, and a little bit of pixel art and animation from many, many years ago. Everything else I had to learn from the ground up. And effectively, I just went onto YouTube and I searched for a Unity tutorial. It was Jack the Giant, a very simple, basic sort of platforming game where you run on clouds and collect coins. Very, very simple stuff. And my initial thought was, I don't know if I can learn this because I'm not very good at math. So I've always convinced myself that I can never become a programmer because you have to be good at maths, right? That was my thought. But eventually I just said, screw it, I'm going to try it. There's nothing to lose. Downloaded the tutorial, got started, very quickly learned that, hey, I can do this. I can actually do this. Coding is not that complicated. And once I learned a little bit from a tutorial, I started implementing that into my own projects. And then whenever I ran into issues and I was like, I want to do this thing, but I don't know how, I went looking for more tutorials. So I was constantly sort of swapping between doing tutorials, learning a little bit from those, then applying it to my own project until I ran into a new dead end, went back to continuing the tutorials, and gradually over time, as you start learning more and more tools from the tutorials, you get better at experimenting with your own project and your own code, and you become less and less reliant on tutorials. And before you know it, you're kind of just coding. So I highly recommend start with a simple tutorial. You don't even really have to finish it. You can have multiple tutorials and then because one thing that I found was I wasn't interested in the games that I was making in the tutorials, right? Those were Flappy Birds, they were platforming Jack the Giant and all kinds of stuff. I didn't care about those games. But I had to go through the tutorials to learn how to make my own game because I had this desire to make my own project. So just pick things that you can learn and then apply them to your own game. And even today, it's even easier because I'll say a word of caution in terms of AI. They're very good at helping you clean up the code that you've written, but don't rely too heavily on them writing all the code for you because they're not very good at that. And you really do want to learn the basics and understand the basics of coding so that you can spot when the AI, like ChatGPT or whatever they are, when they are giving you bad code, because they often do that. So don't rely entirely on AI. Try and use it as a helping tool to sort of point towards what your code is doing wrong, because the AI is often pretty good at spotting that. But beyond that, go for tutorials and try to supplement it with your own passion for what you want to make, because just making the tutorials that you might not be interested in, that's not super engaging and super fun. But there's nothing wrong in just switching from tutorials to your own project. That's how I got started, and I'm a dummy. I don't know anything, and here I am making a game, a rather complex game. So anyone can do it. If I can, certainly anyone else can. And it's super fun. Like once you start learning and get started, it's so rewarding. I highly, highly recommend it.
Great stuff, man. I do appreciate the explanation.
Of course.
Do you have a demo planned? When do you think people will be able to play the game?
Oh, yes. So like I mentioned, right now I'm sort of focused on the roguelike mode, and the story mode is going to take quite a bit of time. I'm starting to realize that it might take longer than anticipated. So I don't have any fixed release dates or plans currently, but I may consider early access, maybe. And that's basically going to be the roguelike mode, which will be a self-contained, fully playable game. And hopefully late 2025. That's sort of what I'm hoping for. But again, no promises. But that's definitely sort of what I'm aiming for, to have a fully working, playable roguelike mode of the game towards the end of next year, 2025.
That sounds very reasonable.
Hopefully.
Alright, man. So, yeah, thanks for coming.
Hey, thanks for doing this. Yeah, I mean, big shout outs to you for actually taking the initiative to do this stuff, because as a solo indie developer, marketing and getting eyes on your project, that's one of the hardest things to do. I mean, you have to develop the game, sure, but that's always going to come. But making people notice your game and getting the exposure, right? Like I can't afford big AAA marketing or even anywhere close, right? So when guys like you with your channel, YouTube channel, and you set up these little interviews for little poor little creators like me and other indie developers, like, that's super helpful, man. Like, really, I love it when people do that. So big thanks and shout out to you for even doing this and for allowing me to come on and talk a bit about my my upcoming project.
Hey, for sure, man. Yeah, it definitely got my interest. It looks cool, and very much looking forward to playing it.
Same. I'm looking forward to playing a version where I don't have to fix bugs every 15 minutes.
I think that
but that's development.
I think that never ends, the bug fixing part.
Oh no. True. That's never going to stop.